The morning Eleanor Marsh was told to leave, she had already been awake for 2 hours. That was her habit, and had been for 5 decades. Up before the house stirred, kettle on the gas ring, the particular silence of a sleeping household settling around her like something she could hold. She used to carry a cup of coffee to Roy in those early hours. He would be sitting in his armchair by the back window, still in his robe, watching the yard the way a man watches something he finds quietly satisfying. He would look up when she came in, take the cup without a word, and nod once. That nod meant something she had never needed him to explain. Roy had been gone for 19 months, and she still made 2 cups every morning. She poured the second one down the sink without looking at it. The house was her son Marcus's house. She had moved into the smaller bedroom at the end of the hall 11 months ago, after Roy died, and the rental property where she and Roy had lived for 31 years passed to a young couple who needed the space. Marcus had offered before she asked. He stood in the doorway of the hospital family room the evening Roy passed, and said, "Come live with us, Mom, we have the room." She had believed him. She was 63 days into grief, and she had believed him the way you believe the ground will hold when you step onto it without looking down. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The morning of the eviction, Diane came downstairs at 7:15. Diane was Marcus's wife of 14 years. She was 41, managed a healthcare billing department, and had the particular manner of someone who had made her decision several days ago and was now simply executing it. She poured herself a coffee, sat across the kitchen table from Eleanor, and set a folded piece of paper on the surface between them with the flat, efficient motion of someone placing a document in a meeting. Eleanor looked at the paper but did not touch it. "Marcus and I have been talking," Diane said. "We found some options for you. There's a senior community in Westfield. It's very well reviewed. Independent living, your own unit, activities, a common dining room. You'd have your own space, which would be better for everyone." Eleanor looked at the piece of paper. A brochure, she realized, not a letter, folded in thirds. The cover showed a white building with a porch and an older woman smiling at a potted geranium. "I have my own space," Eleanor said. "I'm in the room at the end of the hall. You know what I mean." Eleanor didn't know what Diane meant. She had known for several months. The way you know a storm is coming from the way the light changes, not from any single cloud. She had known from the way Diane stopped asking what Eleanor needed at the grocery store, stopped including her in the plans they made for weekends, started speaking to Marcus in those careful flat tones behind closed doors in the evenings. She had known from the morning she came downstairs to find that Diane had rearranged the kitchen, and the shelf where Eleanor kept her bread and her oats had been cleared to make room for a coffee pod machine and a row of matching canisters that said things like flour and sugar and coffee in block letters, even though everyone in the house knew perfectly well what flour looked like. "Where is Marcus?" Eleanor asked. "He had an early meeting." Diane smoothed the front of her blouse and looked out the window at the backyard. "This isn't easy for any of us, but the arrangement isn't working the way we hoped." "Marcus told me to come here," Eleanor said. "After Roy died. He told me himself. He was standing in a doorway at the hospital, and he told me to come." Diane said nothing to that. She touched the edge of the brochure and pushed it a fraction of an inch closer to Eleanor's side of the table. Eleanor looked at it. Then she looked at her own hands, flat on the tabletop. They were her mother's hands, she had always thought. The same wide knuckles, the same 2 veins running across the back like rivers on a map. Her wedding ring sat on the 3rd finger, a thin gold band that Roy had put there in 1973 in a church with peeling paint and a borrowed pianist and 34 guests. She had worn it every day since. The gold had worn thin in one spot, just thin enough to see light through if she held it up. "How long do I have?" Eleanor asked. Diane did not hesitate, which told Eleanor the timeline had been settled before this conversation began. "We'd like to get you into Westfield by the 15th. The 15th was 9 days away. Eleanor stood. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at Diane for a long moment. And Diane looked back, and the kitchen held the silence of 2 women who had very little left to say to each other. "I'll pack today," Eleanor said. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the small room at the end of the hall. The room had a window that faced east and a closet that had never been deep enough and a radiator that knocked twice every morning before the heat came on. She had put Roy's photograph on the dresser the day she moved in. Roy at 58, standing in the backyard of their old rental on Sycamore Place, squinting against the afternoon sun, holding a mug of coffee with both hands. He looked pleased. Roy almost always looked pleased, in a quiet, private way, as though life had worked out slightly better than he had expected, and he did not want to say so too loudly in case it changed. She opened the closet and looked at what she had. 2 pairs of slacks. For blouses. The navy cardigan she had knitted the winter before last. Her church dress, which she had not worn since Roy's funeral. Her orthopedic shoes, and 1 pair of good flats. Her winter coat on the hook behind the door. She took 2 grocery bags from under the sink down the hall. She packed the clothes, her medications, her reading glasses, Roy's photograph in its frame, and a small tin box she had kept in the back of the dresser drawer since the day she cleaned out Roy's belongings at the hospital. The tin box contained his watch, a pocket knife he had carried for 40 years, his reading glasses, and a key. The key was the thing she could not explain. Small, brass, slightly tarnished. She had found it in the breast pocket of the jacket Roy had been wearing the morning the ambulance came. She did not recognize it. She had tried it on every lock in their old rental house, on the mailbox, on Roy's toolbox in the hall closet, on the padlock of the garden storage bin. It fit nothing. She had put it in the tin box and carried it with her to Marcus's house and kept it in the dresser drawer for 11 months without knowing why. She was not superstitious, but the key felt like something she was not yet finished with. She carried the 2 grocery bags downstairs. Diane was gone, back to her home office at the other end of the house, the door closed. Marcus's car was gone from the driveway. The house smelled like coffee and scented candles and someone else's life. Eleanor set the bags by the front door and went back to the kitchen. She washed her cup, dried it, and set it in the cabinet. Old habit. She wiped down the counter where she had stood making her coffee that morning. Then she picked up her bags, opened the front door, and walked out into the October morning. The air was cold and clear and carried the smell of fallen leaves and the distant wood smoke of a neighbor's fireplace. She stood on the front steps for a moment. The street was quiet. A man was walking a dog at the far end of the block, the dog nosing at the base of a mailbox, the man patient and half awake. A school bus moved slowly around the corner and disappeared. She was 74 years old. She had 2 grocery bags of belongings, $60 in her wallet, and a brass key that opened nothing she had tried. She started walking. To understand what happened next and why it matters, you need to know who Eleanor Marsh was before the 11 months at the end of the hall, before Roy's funeral, before any of the practical diminishments that grief and age and a son's good intentions gone sideways can bring to a person's life. You need to go back to the beginning. Not just hers. Theirs. Roy Marsh had been a quiet man for as long as Eleanor knew him, which was 53 years. She met him in 1970 at a church social that she had not wanted to attend. Her friend Gloria had dragged her there on the basis that there would be good food and at least one person worth talking to. Roy was that person, though not in the way Eleanor expected. He did not try to be interesting. He sat at the end of a folding table eating a piece of lemon cake and watching the room with the calm, unhurried attention of a man at ease with himself, and Eleanor sat across from him and said something about the cake, and he agreed with a single specific observation about the lemon-to-sugar ratio that made her laugh before she could stop herself. They talked for 2 hours about nothing consequential and everything important, and when Gloria dragged Eleanor to the car at 10 o'clock, Roy was already standing on the sidewalk outside, having guessed which direction Eleanor would leave by. "I was going to write my phone number on a napkin," he told her later, much later, when that story had become one of the ones they told regularly. "But I thought paper was less reliable than showing up." That was Roy. He did not perform things. He did them. He worked for the County Water Authority for 38 years, starting as a maintenance crew member and finishing as a senior infrastructure inspector. His job was to walk the county's water lines, identify problems before they became failures, and ensure that the systems other people never thought about kept working invisibly beneath their feet. He was good at the work because he had patience for detail and because he did not find repetition deadening the way some people did. He found it clarifying. Same routes, same checks, same careful documentation. He knew what every pressure reading meant, what a certain sound in a pipe wall indicated, what a slight discoloration in concrete told you about what was happening inside. Eleanor taught 5th grade at Millbrook Elementary for 27 years. She taught the same subjects across all those years and never tired of them because no two children processed the same information in quite the same way. And finding the angle that opened a particular child's understanding was, she always said, better than any puzzle she had ever tried. She taught math by telling stories. She taught history through the particular details that most textbooks left out. She kept a jar of peppermints on her desk and a rule that anyone who could explain why something was true instead of just saying that it was got one. They raised their son Marcus in a small rental house on Sycamore Place. 2 bedrooms, a narrow yard, a kitchen with good light, and an old gas range that Eleanor loved and Roy maintained with the same meticulous care he gave to everything mechanical. They were not wealthy. Roy's county salary was steady, Eleanor's teaching salary modest, and between the two they did what needed doing without much left over. But they were comfortable in the way that has nothing to do with money. They had their routines and their rhythms and each other's particular company, and those things held. Their routines were specific. Sunday mornings, Roy made eggs while Eleanor read the paper, not the front section. She always started at the back, and they traded sections across the kitchen table without either of them having to ask. Tuesday evenings they watched whatever documentary was on. They took 2 weeks at the same rented cottage in August for 22 years until the cottage owner sold the property and they shifted, without great complaint, to a cabin 2 towns further north that cost a little more and had a better view of the lake. They walked after dinner in good weather, the same 3-block loop most nights, sometimes extending it as far as the hardware store and back if neither of them was tired. Roy did not hold her hand on these walks. He walked beside her, close enough that their arms brushed when the sidewalk narrowed. That was his version of the same thing. He was a man who showed what he felt through the doing of small things rather than the saying of them. The shelf fitted to the awkward bathroom space. The frame made from cherry. A bowl of her preferred soup left warming on the stove on evenings when she worked late grading papers, and he had already eaten. Once, on a Thursday morning, she had woken dreading a parent meeting she had been anxious about for a week. She came down to find he had left a note on the kitchen counter. For words, you already know how. She kept that note in her Bible for 20 years. Their marriage was not a dramatic one. It did not have great crises or great passionate resolutions. It had 2 people who had decided on each other and kept deciding, day after ordinary day, through the mundane accumulated weight of a life built together. She thought this was what most people did not understand about long marriages. The love was not in the exceptional moments. It was in the Tuesday documentary, and the walked loop, and the second cup of coffee carried to the armchair, and the note on the kitchen counter. It was in every small thing done with someone specifically in mind, over and over, until those small things became the architecture of a whole life. Roy's shed was part of their life at Sycamore Place from almost the beginning. When they moved in, there was a small outbuilding at the back of the yard, barely more than a large wooden box with a corrugated roof and a concrete floor, that the landlord, a compact elderly man named Clifford Oakes, had used for storing garden tools. Roy asked Clifford if he could use it as a workspace, and Clifford said yes without much interest, and Roy cleaned it out, laid new plywood over the rough concrete, put up a pegboard on one wall for tools, ran an extension cord from the house until Clifford let him wire it properly a few years later and padlocked the door. Eleanor never went in. This was not because Roy forbade her, exactly. He never said do not go in. He said it was his thinking place, his private corner, and said it in a way that asked rather than commanded, and she respected that because she had always believed people needed rooms of their own that were theirs alone, even within a marriage. She had her sewing room in the second bedroom before Marcus was born, and her classroom, and her books, and her corner of the garden. Roy had his shed. He went out there most evenings after dinner, sometimes for half an hour, sometimes until 10 at night. She could see the light under the door from the kitchen window when she washed up. In winter, the window above his workbench glowed warm and steady in the dark yard, a square of amber in all the cold black. She found it reassuring in a way she never analyzed. Roy was in his shed. The kettle was on. Everything was where it should be. She assumed he worked on small projects. Tools, repairs, the sort of thing practical men do with their hands in the evenings. He brought her things sometimes. A small shelf for the bathroom, fitted exactly to the awkward space above the radiator. A wooden caddy for her knitting needles, stained a dark walnut. A picture frame he'd built from a piece of cherry he found at the lumber yard, which she used for the photograph from their 20th anniversary. She thanked him each time and put the items to use and never pressed him for more, because that was their way. He did not explain his private workings. She did not ask him to. For 31 years at Sycamore Place, that was how it was. Roy died on a Wednesday in March, 22 months ago. He was at his regular Wednesday morning inspection route, walking a stretch of water main off the county road at the edge of town. His colleague Darnell was with him, had been with him on Wednesday routes for 16 years. Roy stopped beside a maintenance access panel, said he needed a minute, and sat down on the grass verge. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. The doctor at the county hospital said it was sudden and said it was cardiac, which covered the fact that death at 72, out in the open air, doing the work you had done for 40 years, arrives without the courtesy of preparation regardless of what anyone tells you afterward. Eleanor got the call from Darnell's phone. She was in the kitchen making her weekly shopping list. She sat down on the floor, right there between the counter and the table, and stayed there for a time she could not account for. The shopping list was still on the table when she got up. The weeks that followed had the quality of moving through water. Marcus drove up the day of the phone call and stayed through the funeral. He handled the paperwork, the calls, the arrangements, with the same organized efficiency Diane brought to everything. Eleanor was grateful for this in the way you are grateful for practical help when grief has reduced you to performing the basic motions of a day. Marcus was steady. He was present. He sat with her in the evenings and did not try to say things that could not be said. The question of the shed arose on the fourth day. Marcus walked out into the yard in the afternoon and came back to say the shed was locked, and he had not found a key in Roy's belongings, and asked Eleanor where the spare was. Eleanor did not know. Roy had never mentioned a spare key for the shed. She had no idea where her own key might be for a lock she had never used. "I'll break it open when I get a chance," Marcus said, "and go through whatever's in there." He did not get a chance before the weekend ended, and he drove back to his own life. And he did not get a chance on the weekends. He came back in April and May. And by June, Eleanor's rental on Sycamore Place was ending, and Marcus was in her living room saying, "Come live with us, Mom. We have the room." And the shed was still locked, and the question of it was lost in the larger weight of everything else. She found the key 3 weeks after the funeral, going through Roy's personal effects from the hospital bag. His jacket was in there, folded. She went through the pockets out of habit, the way you do with a loved one's clothes before washing them. And there it was in the breast pocket. Small, brass, slightly tarnished. She held it for a long time, standing in the bedroom of their old rental house, surrounded by the half-packed evidence of 31 years of living in one place. Then she put it in the tin box with Roy's watch and his pocket knife and his reading glasses, because she was not ready to try it on anything yet, and she was not sure she would ever be. 11 months at Marcus's house. Then the brochure with the smiling woman and the geranium, and the 9 days, and the grocery bags, and the $60, and the morning. Eleanor walked for almost an hour before she understood where she was going. She passed through the center of town without any particular intention. She was walking because standing still felt impossible, and sitting somewhere public felt worse. The hardware store. The diner where she and Roy had eaten Sunday breakfast for the first 12 years of their marriage, before they switched to the diner on Clement Road, which was further away but had better pie. The library where she had spent her summers between teaching years, and where Roy had picked her up every Friday evening for years. Places that carried the specific accumulated weight of a life, lived somewhere long enough to matter. She sat on a bench outside the post office for a while. An older man passed and nodded at her the way people nod at strangers who are seated and unhurried. She nodded back. The October sun moved slowly in the sky. Leaves came down from the maple on the corner in that gentle, deliberate way they do on clear, cold days, one at a time, each one with the unhurried certainty of something that has been letting go for a while and has finally reached the right moment. She got up and kept walking, and it was only when the street began to feel familiar in a specific way, familiar in the grain of it rather than the general shape, that she realized she had walked the 3 miles from Marcus's house to Sycamore Place without deciding to. The house looked the same from the outside. White clapboard with the dark green shutters. Clifford Oaks had repainted every 4 years for as long as she could remember. The young couple who had moved in were not visible. A bicycle was locked to the porch railing. A wind chime she did not recognize hung from the eave at the corner, turning slowly. She stood on the sidewalk across the street for a while. She was not looking at the house, exactly. She was looking past it, at the roofline, at the angle of the yard behind, at the particular corner of the back fence where the yard turned. She crossed the street and walked down the narrow passage between the house and the neighboring property. This was the way to the yard. She had walked it 10,000 times. The path was the same narrow strip of cracked concrete it had always been, the same wooden fence on the right with its row of pickets that had been painted so many times they were round rather than sharp at the tips. She came out into the backyard. The yard was different in small ways. The rose bush she had planted in 2003 was larger, wilder, unpruned. A child's plastic slide sat near the left fence. The old vegetable patch was lawn now. The shed was exactly where it had always been, at the far end of the yard against the back fence. Same corrugated roof, same weathered wood siding. The padlock hung on its hasp, closed. Eleanor stood and looked at it. She had stood in this yard hundreds of times, thousands of times, looking at this shed with the light under the door or the light from the window, and feeling what she had always felt, which was a particular quiet reassurance. Roy is in there. Everything is where it should be. Roy was not in there now. She knew that. But she stood looking at it anyway, and something moved through her that was not quite grief and not quite memory, but something between them, a warmth with an ache in it. She did not hear Clifford Oakes come out of the house until he spoke. Eleanor. She turned. He was standing on the back step of the main house, the landlord's portion, which occupied the front half of the building. He was 83 now, she thought, or 84. He had the lean, slightly stooped posture of a tall man whose spine had begun to lose its argument with gravity. He wore a cardigan over his collar and tie even on a Saturday morning, which was something she had always found quietly charming. He was holding a coffee cup. "Clifford," she said, "I'm sorry to come through without asking." "You walked that path for 31 years, he said, stepping down into the yard. "You don't need to ask." He came toward her, moving slowly, and stopped a few feet away and looked at her with the careful attention of someone who had known a person long enough to read their face accurately. "Are you all right?" "No," she said, because Clifford was not the kind of person you told empty things to. He had buried his wife, Margaret, 6 years before Roy died. He was not fooled by fine. He looked at the grocery bags she was still carrying. He looked at her face. He did not ask her to explain. "Come in and have something warm," he said. She sat at his kitchen table, which was the same kitchen table she had sat at dozens of times over the years, for neighborly cups of tea, for the occasional shared meal in the later years when Margaret was gone and Eleanor was in the habit of sending food next door, and Clifford was in the habit of returning the containers personally and being invited in. The table was the same old one, scarred along one edge where a grandchild had dragged something sharp across it years ago. The kitchen smelled like toast and radiator warmth. He made tea without asking what she wanted and set a plate of digestive biscuits between them and sat down across from her, and she told him what had happened that morning. She told it plainly, the way she always told hard things, without decoration or appeal for sympathy. Diane and the brochure and the 9 days and the grocery bags. By the time she finished, the tea was the right temperature, and she drank some. Clifford listened with the particular quality of attention that older people sometimes develop, the kind that does not interrupt, does not offer while you are still speaking, does not reach for reassurance before the person is done needing to be heard. He had sat with Eleanor in this kitchen before, in the years after Margaret died, when Eleanor had been the one bringing soup and staying to talk, and he had learned that she needed the same thing she gave. Space to say the thing fully before anything else was offered. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. The radiator ticked once in the quiet. A pigeon landed on the kitchen windowsill and left again. The boy was always more like his father than he knew, Clifford said. He did not explain what he meant by that, and Eleanor did not ask, because she thought she understood. Clifford was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where are you planning to go?" "I don't know yet." He turned his cup in his hands. "Margaret's sister took ill 2 months ago. I've been thinking about going up to be near her for a while, but I haven't wanted to leave the house. I was going to hire someone to check on it." Eleanor looked at him. "The young couple in the front is fine," he said, "but they're not always around, and the property needs eyes on it." He set down his cup. "The back room off the kitchen has a proper bed. I'll not charge you rent if you'll keep an eye on things while I'm up north." She looked at him. Then she looked out his kitchen window. From this angle, through the glass, she could see the back of the yard, the rear fence, the shed. Roy's shed. Still locked. Still there. "Clifford," she said, When you took over the yard after we moved out. The shed at the back. I left it alone, he said. Seemed right. Roy built that bench inside, wired the electrics, put up the pegboard. It was his space. Did you ever go inside? Not once. The padlock was his, and I didn't have a key. He paused. Still don't. Eleanor set down her cup. She reached into her coat pocket, past her wallet, past her phone, and found the tin box. She opened it on the table. Roy's watch in its face-up position. Hand stopped at 8:47, the last time anyone had wound it. His pocket knife, folded. His reading glasses in their case. And the key. Small, brass, tarnished at the bow. She picked it up and held it in her palm. It was so light it was nearly nothing. Clifford looked at it. He did not say anything. I found it in his jacket pocket, Eleanor said. The day he died. I've had it 11 months, and I haven't tried it on anything that worked. Clifford said, You know what it opens. She looked at him. You've known for a while, he said, gently. You just weren't ready. She closed her hand around the key and felt the small press of its teeth against her palm. She was ready now. The yard in late morning held the particular quality of October light that makes everything look both familiar and slightly altered, as if the angle of the sun has shifted the world a few degrees from what you expected. Eleanor walked across the dry grass, past the rose bush, to the back fence where Roy's shed sat in the corner shadow of the boards. She had the key in her right hand. The grocery bag she had left on Clifford's kitchen floor. She stopped a few feet from the door and looked at the padlock for a long time before she moved to touch it. The hasp, the staple set into the doorframe wood. The loop of the shackle, closed. She had walked past this door 10,000 times in 31 years and never paused at it this way. Never studied it the way you study something you are about to change. She had always walked past it the way you walk past a room that belongs to someone else, which is to say without reading anything into the closed door, because a closed door is just a door and the privacy behind it is just privacy, and you trust the person you love to come back out when the work is done. Roy had not come back out. Not from the shed. Not from the county road at the edge of town, where Darnell had knelt beside him in the grass. And so Eleanor stood in front of his padlocked door with the key he had kept on his person, in his breast pocket, carried against his chest for reasons she had not known until this morning, and she put the key in the lock. The wood of the siding was dry and silvered in places, but sound. Roy had painted it the same gray-green as the back fence in 1991, and the paint had held better than most. The corrugated roof had a slight bow at the center that had been there for 10 years and had never worsened. The one window, set high on the wall facing the yard, was opaque with old dust on the inside of the glass. The padlock was a heavy brass master lock, the same one Roy had used from the beginning. The casing was dark with weather, but the mechanism was clean. Roy had always kept it oiled. She knew that without having thought of it for years. She knew the way you know small habits of a person you have lived alongside for half a century, not from being told, just from proximity. She looked at the padlock. She looked at the key. She thought about the years she had stood in the kitchen window watching the light in the shed and feeling that specific reassurance. She thought about the 31 years she had not once opened this door, not once pushed for what Roy kept private in there, not out of indifference, but out of the same respect he showed her private rooms and private thoughts. She thought about the 11 months she had carried this key in a tin box next to his watch. She thought about Diane and the brochure and the 9 days and the grocery bags and the morning she had walked 3 miles without knowing where she was going and ended up here. She put the key into the padlock. The fit was perfect. The key seated cleanly, without any jiggling or forcing, the way a key seats in its own lock. She felt the mechanism engage, felt the small resistance and then the release, and the padlock opened in her hand, heavy and warm in the October sun. She stood holding the open padlock for a moment. The hasp hung free. She reached up and swung it clear of the staple. Then she gripped the door handle, an old iron pull Roy had fitted himself, and pulled the door toward her. The door opened on hinges that were silent. Roy had kept them oiled too. Inside was dark. The window behind her, covered in its film of interior dust, let in very little. The doorway let in the rest, a column of October light falling across the threshold and extending several feet into the space. Eleanor stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The first thing she saw was the workbench. It ran the full length of the wall to her right, a solid surface of aged wood with a fitted rail along the back edge to keep things from rolling off. Roy had built it himself in the first year at Sycamore Place, fitted it to the wall with care and without visible fasteners except at the legs. A small desk lamp sat at the far left end, its cord running to a power strip beneath the bench. The second thing she saw was the shelving, floor to ceiling on the left wall and the back wall. Shelves he had built himself from plain boards, spaced precisely, each one level and fitted tight to the uprights without a gap. And on the shelves, arranged in rows with the same particular care Roy brought to everything, were binders. Ring binders, dozens of them, each one identical in size and color, each one labeled on the spine in Roy's small, square handwriting. Eleanor stepped inside. She reached the light switch beside the door and pressed it. The overhead light came on, a single hanging fixture, and the room came fully into view. She stood very still. The binders on the left wall were labeled by year. She read the nearest spines without touching them. 1971, 1972, 1973, going back, and going back, and going back. The earliest ones were thinner. The later ones were thick, overstuffed, some with additional sleeves tucked behind the cover. All the way to 2021. On the back wall, different labels. Identified in Roy's hand as series, as country of origin, as particular categories she did not yet understand. A row of them marked mint condition, authenticated, not for sale. A separate section on the lower shelves held long, flat boxes, the kind that close with a press clasp. She crouched and opened one. Inside were rows of small clear plastic holders, each one containing a coin. She did not know coins well enough to identify what she was looking at. She could see that they were varied in size and color, that some of the holders bore small handwritten labels in Roy's script, that the oldest-looking ones were stored in individual soft envelopes within the holders. She stayed crouched looking at the coins for a long time. Some were American. She could see the profiles she recognized, the dates stamped along the edges. Others were foreign, worn smooth or deliberately preserved in their holders, marked with lettering in languages she didn't know. One holder at the far end of the row contained a coin so dark it looked almost black, marked with a label that read simply 1793 in Roy's pencil script. She did not know what a coin from 1793 was worth. She had no framework for that. She returned the flat box to the shelf and closed the press clasp as carefully as she had opened it. She moved to the binders. She pulled the one labeled 1971 from the shelf and held it carefully. The binder's cover was stiff and slightly warped with age, but intact. She opened it. Inside were plastic sleeve pages, the kind with individual pockets, and in each pocket a stamp. Some mounted on small pieces of white cardstock, some in clear holders of their own. Each one labeled in Roy's handwriting in the white space below the sleeve, so small she had to lean close. Country, denomination, year, condition, a brief note about acquisition in some cases, where he had bought it, what he had paid. The stamps themselves were extraordinary, not in a way she could assess technically, but in the way of small things made beautiful by careful attention. Tiny engraved pictures on paper the size of a thumbnail. Birds, buildings, ships, portraits, geometric designs from countries she had never visited. She turned page after page. The 1971 binder held maybe 40 stamps. The later ones, she could see from the thickness of them on the shelves, held far more. Roy had been doing this for 50 years. She set the binder back in its place and stood with her hands at her sides, looking at the shelves. Stamps and coins. Roy had been collecting stamps and coins, secretly, methodically, for as long as they had lived in this house. Perhaps longer. The binders went back to 1971, the year after they met. She was not thinking yet about value or money or what any of this meant in practical terms. She was thinking about Roy going to his shed in the evenings. Roy in his robe watching the yard. Roy taking his Wednesday inspection routes with patient care, walking water lines underground, keeping invisible systems working. Roy who had never wanted much, who had been satisfied by good work done quietly, who had brought her a shelf fitted to the right wall space and a frame made from a piece of cherry he had found. Small beautiful things offered without fanfare or expectation of remark. She was thinking about the way he would sometimes come in from the shed late, after she had gone to bed, and she would hear him wash his hands in the kitchen sink before coming upstairs. A deliberate, unhurried sound. She used to think he washed his hands that way to avoid waking her. Now she thought he was washing his hands the way a man washes his hands after a day's honest work, slowly, completely, with satisfaction. She was thinking about the word private. She had always respected his privacy in the shed the way she respected any person's need for a space entirely their own. But there was a difference, she understood now, between privacy and secrecy, and she was standing in the middle of Roy's 50-year secret in a locked shed in October with $60 in her pocket in a morning that had already held more grief than she had expected to carry today, and she was not angry. She was not angry at all. She was something more complicated and harder to name, a feeling that sat between wonder and sorrow, and something that might have been, if she let herself call it by its right name, gratitude. She had not known it all. She stood and turned in a slow circle, taking in the full room. The binders, the coin boxes, the workbench with its neat tools along the back rail, Roy's magnifying glass on its stand at the corner of the bench, positioned for good light from the overhead fixture. A reference book, thick and cloth-bound, open face down on the bench surface. She picked it up and looked at the spine. Scott's specialized catalog of United States stamps and covers. The pages were marked throughout with his handwriting in pencil, tiny annotations beside listings she couldn't make sense of. On the end of the workbench, between the lamp and the catalog, was a small fireproof safe. Gray steel, maybe 1.5 feet square, with a combination dial and a recessed handle. It sat on a square of anti-slip rubber mat, positioned so the dial faced outward when you stood at the bench. Roy had bolted it to a metal plate that was itself anchored to the underside of the bench with long steel bolts run through the wood. She crouched and checked this without knowing why, and it was correct, just as she suspected, just as she would have expected. He did not leave important things unsecured. The combination. She stood up and looked at the dial. She knew the combination. She knew it the same way she had known, somehow, that the brass key would open the padlock. She could not have said with certainty when she knew it or how, only that standing in front of this safe in Roy's shed, the number came to her without effort, the way a familiar address comes to you when you stop trying to remember it. Their wedding date, May 17th, 1973. He had used it for his luggage lock on every trip they ever took together. He used it for the combination on the lockbox in the rental house, where they kept their passports and the car registration and the deed to Marcus's college savings account. He used the same combination for everything that mattered. She turned the dial slowly. Left to 5, right to 17, left to 73. The handle turned. The door swung open. Inside, on the top shelf, banded in rubber bands and stacked with the particular neatness Roy brought to everything he cared about, was money. Cash. Stacks of bills. Each bundle held together with a rubber band and a small paper label on which Roy had written the amount in his square, unhurried print. Below the cash, on the lower shelf, were 2 items. A legal-sized envelope, unsealed, with her name written on the front, and a small wooden box. Eleanor looked at the box for a moment without touching it. Cherry wood, smooth as glass. Fitted lid with no hinge, the kind that lifts off cleanly because the fit is so precise it holds by itself. Roy had made this. She knew his work by now in a way she had not known it this morning. The specific grain of his attention to surface, the proportions he chose, the way he thought about the small necessary details that most people would never notice. She set the box on the bench beside the open safe. Then she picked up the envelope with her name on it. Roy's handwriting on the envelope was the same as she had known for 53 years. She had read it on birthday cards and grocery lists and the notes he had occasionally left on the counter when he went out early and did not want to wake her. The M was specific, the 2 peaks rising at a certain angle. The A dropped slightly below the line. The Y swept in a particular direction. She pressed the envelope flat against her palm and looked at it for a long time. She had carried a key she did not understand for 11 months. She had walked 3 miles in an October morning without knowing where she was going. She had stood in a yard and heard a padlock open. She had stood in a room that was Roy's secret room, his real thinking place, his private corner of a life they had shared for over half a century, and understood that she had known him completely and not known him at all, and that both of these things were true at the same time and did not contradict each other. She sat down on the low wooden stool Roy had kept beside the bench. The stool was worn smooth on the seat, the edges rounded by years of use. She could see, faintly, In the wood of the seat, the impression of where Roy's weight had settled most often, a slight dip on the right side where he would have sat to work under the lamp. She turned the envelope over. The flap was unsealed. Roy had not sealed it. He had left it open, as though he knew she would need to open it quickly, without ceremony, and had not wanted to make her work for it. She reached inside and unfolded the pages. 3 sheets of lined paper, filled front and back. His handwriting from the first line to the last, pressed firmly into the page, each line straight across without the aid of any guide. The ink was blue, not faded, not smeared. Clear and present, the words of a man who had sat in this room in the evenings and wanted her to find them. The first line read, "Eleanor, my love, if you are reading this, then I did not get to tell you myself, and I owe you an explanation that is 50 years overdue. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." She read it again. That first line. She read it 3 times with her thumb holding the edge of the paper and the October light coming in through the open shed door behind her. Outside, the rose bush moved in the slight wind. A bird crossed the yard without landing. The leaves on the single old oak at the back fence turned slowly, gold and rust, and the particular shade of late October amber that only comes once a year and then is gone. From Clifford's kitchen window, she knew, he could see the shed door standing open. She knew he was not watching. He was giving her what she needed, which was this: the room, the air, the letter, and time. Inside the shed, Eleanor held Roy's letter in both hands and began to read. Roy's handwriting filled 3 pages front and back, pressed firmly and evenly into the lined paper. Each letter formed with the same deliberate care he gave to his inspection reports, his maintenance logs, his precise pencil annotations in the margins of his catalogs. The ink was blue ballpoint. In 2 places, small dots sat beside a word where the pen had paused before continuing. The marks a man leaves when he is working out how to say the next thing honestly. Eleanor read slowly. She had always read slowly. 27 years of teaching children to read had made her attend to each word the way she asked them to, without skipping ahead to the end, without deciding what something meant before you had finished taking it in. The letter began the way she had already seen, with his formal opening, "My love," which was not how Roy spoke aloud, but was how he wrote, in the considered, slightly older cadence of a man who believed written words carried different weight than spoken ones and should be chosen accordingly. Then, "I need to start at the beginning, which means starting before you, which is a strange place to start any story I am trying to tell you. My father collected stamps. His name was Bernard, and you knew him only in his last years, when he was quiet and slow and smelled like the peppermint lozenges he kept in his cardigan pocket. But when I was a boy, he was different. He was a man who could hold a stamp up to the light in the kitchen window and tell you, in the time it took you to put down your fork, exactly where it came from, who had engraved the design, what the paper weight meant about the era of its printing, and why any of that should matter to anyone who was paying attention. He had a way of making small things feel important. I think that is where I learned it." She stopped at that. Roy's father. She had met Bernard Marsh only 3 times before he died. A short, compact man with thick fingers and reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead even when he was not reading anything. She had not known about the stamps. She had not known there was anything to know. "He gave me a small album when I turned 12. 50 pages, cloth cover, navy blue, with his initials stamped on the front in gold ink that had mostly worn off by the time I received it. A few hundred stamps inside. Nothing rare, nothing with much monetary value even then, but each one placed with care, each one labeled in his handwriting. Countries I had never seen. Colors that did not exist in our town." He said, "Roy, every one of these came from somewhere and went somewhere and passed through someone's hands before it got here. A stamp is a record of movement. It is evidence that the world was larger than your kitchen window." Eleanor set the first page on the workbench and picked up the second. Her thumb left a print on the corner. She did not try to smooth it away. "I kept the album. I kept it through school and through the 2 years I worked at the hardware store before the county hired me. And I kept it through the evening I met you at Gloria Patterson's church social and understood, before the conversation was 2 hours old, that you were the person I had been waiting to meet without knowing I was waiting. I kept it through our wedding and through the early years at Sycamore Place when money was the thing we talked around carefully instead of talking about directly. And I kept it in the shed from the moment Clifford let me use it, because the shed was mine in a way nothing else was, and the stamps were mine in a way I could not explain without sounding like I was holding something back from you, which is exactly what I was doing, and I am sorry for that. She read that sentence twice. Holding something back. Roy, who had been in all other respects the most transparent person she had known, not because he offered everything up voluntarily, but because he did not deceive. He said what he thought when he thought it was worth saying, and said nothing when it wasn't, and the space between those two things was not deception but proportion. He had always had extraordinary proportion. I want to explain why I didn't tell you, and I want you to understand that the explanation is true even though I know it will also sound like an excuse, and I will let you decide which it is when you have heard it. In the early years at Sycamore Place, we were not poor, but we were careful. You know that. You remember the months we calculated the grocery list to the dollar before I went. The year the furnace needed replacing, and we ate simply for 6 months while we paid it back. I had begun to add to my father's collection by then, just slowly, just a stamp here and a stamp from a dealer there, nothing dramatic. And I did not tell you because I did not want you to tell me to stop. And I knew if you knew about the money I was spending you would feel you had to, not because you would be wrong, but because you were careful and I was asking you to carry the careful weight of our life while I spent $20 on a piece of paper the size of a postage stamp. That is not something a fair person asks. The radiator in Clifford's kitchen was ticking somewhere behind the house wall. A distant, steady sound. Eleanor was not in Clifford's kitchen. She was on the stool in Roy's shed, and the October light was moving across the floor the way it does in the middle of the morning, shifting by degrees. But here is where the excuse becomes something else, Eleanor, and I want you to hear this part carefully. After the first few years, the money stopped matching the way it had. The collection had grown enough that I was selling pieces I duplicated or upgraded, selling them carefully, only to people who understood what they were buying, keeping records of everything. The money went into the safe. It was enough that I was not spending our money on the collection. I was building the collection on its own, and it was growing. And by the time I understood what I had in here, what it had become over 10, 15, 20 years of patient looking and careful buying and trading up and knowing what to keep, I did not tell you because I did not know how to tell you. Not because I was ashamed, because I wanted to show you. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. That was always the plan. To show you. I was going to bring you out here on the morning of our 50th anniversary and open the door and let you see it the way I have seen it every evening for 30 years, all of it in the same room. The thing a man builds quietly when he loves someone and does not have the words to say so as loudly as he means it. I have never been a man of large declarations, Eleanor. You know that. I am a man who checks the fit of a pipe joint twice before he signs off on it, who reads a water pressure gauge the same way every single time, because the same care every single time is how you catch the thing before it becomes a failure. I built this collection the same way I built everything I cared about. Slowly, on purpose, for a specific reason. The reason was you. It was always you. She had to stop reading for a while. She sat on the stool and put the pages face down on the workbench and looked at the wall of binders. 1971, 1972, 1973. She had been teaching 5th grade in 1973. Roy had been walking water lines for the county and spending his shed evenings adding stamps to an album his father had given him at 12 and building something he intended to show her on a morning that would have been 2 years from now. She picked the pages back up and continued. The collection has 2 parts. Stamps and coins. You have seen the binders by now, I think, and I want to tell you about some of the pieces I am most proud of, not because pride is the right word exactly, but because you should know what you are looking at. In 1988, I acquired a pair of 1847 5-cent Benjamin Franklin stamps in near mint condition. These are among the first stamps the United States government ever issued. They are not common. A single example in lesser condition than these 2 sells for prices that would have surprised your father. A matched pair like these, in the grade that Gerald Carver confirmed when I showed them to him in 2019, is the kind of thing serious collectors spend decades trying to find and often don't. She had to read that part again. 1847. The year of those stamps was 1847. Roy had been handling something from 1847 in his shed in the evenings while she washed the dinner plates on the other side of the kitchen window. In 1994, I found a complete pane of the 1869 pictorial issue. 12 stamps, unperforated, full original gum. The 1869 pictorials were the first American stamps to use two-color printing, and they are some of the most beautiful stamps this country ever produced. A complete pane in the condition I have is exceptionally unusual. Gerald will tell you more about what that means in current market terms. There are other significant pieces, Confederate States issues, early airmail examples, foreign rarities I acquired through trades over the years, each one documented in the binders with the date acquired and the price paid and the condition grade at time of purchase. Every entry has been honest. I was always honest with myself in there, even when I was keeping the whole thing from you. And I want you to know that those two things were separate in my mind. I was not dishonest with you. I was private. I know that is not a complete absolution, but it is the truth. Roy. His handwriting on the third page was slightly less even than on the first two, the lines sitting less exactly on the ruled paper. He had been tired when he wrote this page, or had set it down and come back to it. She could see where the pen pressure changed. The coins are in the flat boxes on the lower shelves. The most significant piece is a 1793 chain cent, one of the first copper coins the United States Mint produced in its first year of operation. It is in fine condition, which in coin terms means it is worn from circulation, but all the major details are clear and the chain on the reverse is complete. Gerald examined it in 2019 as well. He said very little about it, which with Gerald means he was impressed. The rest of the coin collection runs from early American copper through Morgan silver dollars and several gold pieces I acquired over a 15-year period when gold was undervalued relative to its significance. All of it is documented in the ledger on the workbench shelf, the green cloth-covered one, second from the left. She had not yet opened the green ledger. She had been standing in front of the binders and not known what she was looking at except that it was Roy's, and it was serious, and it was 50 years of a private life she had respected without ever knowing how much was inside it. In 2019, before his health began to decline, I showed Gerald the collection in full for the first time. He came here on a Saturday in October when you were at the quilting circle. He spent 4 hours. When he was done, he sat on the stool where you are probably sitting now, Eleanor, and he put his hands on his knees, and he said, "Roy, do you understand what you have built in here?" I told him I had some idea. He said the collection as a whole, if properly presented and sold through the right channels at the right time, would conservatively realize in excess of $1.5 million. Gerald is a conservative man. When Gerald says conservatively, you should take the number and add to it. $1.5 million. Eleanor set the pages flat on the workbench and placed her palm on top of them. She pressed down. The paper held. Roy had built something worth more than $1.5 million in a shed the size of a large bathroom at the back of a rented yard on Sycamore Place. In the evenings, over 50 years, while she watched from the kitchen window and thought he was fixing small things. She thought about the grocery list calculated to the dollar. She thought about the 6 careful months of simple eating while they paid back the furnace. She thought about Roy's county salary and her teaching salary and the particular pride they had both taken in doing well enough on what they had. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about the binders on the shelves and the flat boxes and the 1793 coin in its holder and the pair of stamps from 1847, and she understood that Roy had not been keeping money from her when money was tight. He had been building something outside of their money. Something that was not about the grocery list or the furnace or the careful arithmetic of a modest life. Something that was its own separate enterprise, built on patience and knowledge and the specific devotion of a man who did not know how to say what he felt as loudly as he felt it. Gerald's number is written in pencil on the inside back cover of the 2015 Scott catalog on the bench. His full name is Gerald Carver, Carver's fine philately. He knows about you. I told him that when I showed him the collection. I told him my wife does not know this room exists yet, and he said he understood, and he did not say it the way people say they understand when they don't. He said it the way a person says it who has kept something private for a long time himself and knows what that costs. Call Gerald. He will take care of you. He knows exactly what is here and exactly what it is worth, and he is an honest man, which in his business is rarer than a mint 1847 Franklin, and worth considerably more. She almost laughed at that. Roy making a joke in the letter he had written for the possibility of his own death, Roy slipping in the precise dry observation he would have made if he had been sitting beside her on the stool. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth again. This time she held it there longer. There is $34,000 in the safe. Every dollar of it came from the collection, from pieces I sold over the years through Gerald or through the specialized dealers he referred me to. I never touched it. I want you to use it immediately for whatever you need right now, today, before Gerald and the appraisal and all the rest of it. That money is not complicated. It does not require anyone else's involvement. It is in the safe, and the safe is open, and it is yours. The wooden box is also in the safe. Open it when you are ready, not before. You will know when you are ready. I want to tell you what I was going to say to you on the morning of our 50th anniversary. I had it planned. I was going to bring you out here before breakfast, which you would have found strange, and I was going to open the door, and I was going to stand beside you while you looked at it all, and I was going to wait until you were ready to speak, however long that took. And then I was going to say, Eleanor, every evening I was in here, I was thinking about you. Not in a large dramatic way. The small specific way. The way you take your coffee. The angle you hold a book. The particular patience you had with Marcus when he was difficult and difficult children from school, and me on the evenings I came in too tired to be good company. I was thinking about those things in here, and I was building something because I did not have another language for what I wanted to say, which is this. You are the best decision I ever made, and I made it every single day without ever reconsidering it. And the only thing I regret is that I was better at showing it in wood and paper and coin than I was at saying it out loud where you could hear me. I love you, Eleanor. I should have said it more. I said it every evening in here instead. Yours always, and without reservation, Roy Thomas Marsh. She sat on the stool for a long time after the letter ended. The shed was very still. The light through the open door had moved across the floor by several feet. Late morning now, approaching noon. She could hear, distantly, a car passing on Sycamore Place, and the dry rustle of leaves against the outside of the shed wall, and nothing else. She read the letter again from the beginning. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and held it against her chest with both hands. She thought about 52 years of marriage and how much of a person you could know and still not know. She thought about the evenings. The particular routine of their Sycamore Place evenings. Dinner, and the table cleared, and Roy disappearing out the back door while she settled into her reading, or her sewing, or the stacks of papers she brought home to grade. She had found those evenings peaceful. She had found the whole arrangement peaceful, Roy in his thinking place, herself in hers, the house quiet and warm, and both of them doing their private work in parallel, without crowding each other. She had thought she was respecting his space. She had been, in a sense. But she was also simply not knowing. And the difference between respecting someone's privacy and simply not knowing what is on the other side of a locked door is the difference between trust and distance. And she was only now, sitting in Roy's shed with his letter against her chest, beginning to understand how much distance had existed inside all that trust. Not angry. She pressed that down and examined it again, and it was still not anger. She did not know the name for what she was feeling. It was too large and too full to reduce to a single word, or even several words. It held grief and wonder and something very old and warm that was Roy's specific presence. The 52 years of being close to him, felt now in the room where he had been most fully himself in secret, and the strange tenderness of finally meeting him here. She set the letter on the bench. She stood and walked the shed one more time, slowly, touching nothing, just looking. The binders, the flat boxes, the reference books along the back edge of the bench, worn at the spines, tabbed with small handwritten page markers. The green cloth ledger Roy had mentioned, the magnifying glass on its adjustable stand. The photograph she found only now, pinned to the pegboard above the bench with a single pushpin. Her and Roy, from the summer of 1984, standing in front of the cottage they rented in August. She was laughing at something outside the frame. Roy was looking at her, not at the camera, at her. He had put that photograph above his workbench where he could see it every evening. She unpinned it carefully and held it in both hands, and looked at herself from 40 years ago, laughing at something she couldn't remember. Roy looking at her the way he always looked at her, with that particular settled attention, as though the thing he was watching was exactly where he expected it to be, and he was grateful it was there. She put the photograph in the pocket of her coat. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She went back into the safe and took out the money. She counted it on the bench. $34,220, in banded stacks exactly as Roy had noted, each bundle labeled. She stacked it carefully on the bench surface beside the open safe and looked at it. She had $60 in her wallet. She had 2 grocery bags of clothing and medication and 1 tin box of a dead man's effects. She had 9 days before Marcus expected her to make her own arrangements. She now had $34,220 and a padlocked shed full of things a man named Gerald Carver had assessed at conservatively more than $1.5 million. She left the cash on the bench. She was not ready to move it yet. She closed the safe door without resetting the combination, picked up Roy's letter, and walked back across the yard to Clifford's kitchen. He was at the table with his tea, reading, his glasses on the end of his nose. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her face and then at the letter in her hand. He did not ask questions. She sat down. She set the letter on the table between them. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Roy had been collecting stamps and coins for 50 years, she said. In the shed. He kept it private. He had a dealer who authenticated the significant pieces in 2019. She paused. The dealer told him the collection would conservatively realize over $1.5 million. Clifford set down his tea. He looked at the letter on the table. He looked at Eleanor. There is also $34,000 in cash in a fireproof safe, she said, from sales he made over the years. Clifford was quiet for a long moment. Roy came out here on a Saturday in October 3 years ago, he said at last. With another man I didn't know. I was at the kitchen window when they arrived. They went into the shed together. Stayed about 4 hours. He paused. I didn't mention it to you because Roy had never asked me to account for who came and went through the yard, and it wasn't my business to. But I remember thinking the other man had the manner of someone who knew what things were worth. Gerald Carver, Eleanor said. He's a philatelist. Roy's letter says to call him. Then you should call him. I know. She sat at Clifford's table and looked at the wall above his stove, where Margaret's old kitchen calendar still hung, open to the month of her passing, the dates marked with her handwriting in faded pencil. A doctor's appointment, a haircut, a note that said call Eleanor on the 14th, circled. She had not called. She didn't remember why. Clifford, she said, did you know Roy well? He considered the question with the care it deserved. I knew him the way you know a neighbor for 30 years. The weather report and the fence and the shared opinion about the state of the road at the end of the block. I knew he worked carefully. I knew he was reliable. I knew he thought the world of you. He paused. He used to come in here sometimes for a cup of tea when you were at your quilting circle. We would sit where we're sitting now, and he would not say much, and I would not say much, and it was a comfortable arrangement. I always had the sense that there was a great deal going on in Roy that he did not put into words. There was, Eleanor said. She found the 2015 Scott catalog on the bench where Roy had described it, a large reference volume with a red and white cover, its spine cracked from repeated use. She opened the back cover. In Roy's pencil, on the inside board, a name and a phone number. Gerald Carver. Below the number, 2 words. He knows. She looked at those 2 words for a while. He knows. Roy telling her from across the distance of 19 months that she would not be alone in this. That he had arranged for someone to understand what she was looking at. Someone who could translate the binders and the flat boxes and the green ledger into language the world would accept. He had thought of this. He had thought of everything except the possibility that he would not be the one to open the door for her. She took out her phone. She dialed the number. It rang 4 times. She was composing a message in her mind for the voicemail when the line connected. Carver's. A man's voice. Precise, unhurried, with a slight New England flatness. Is this Gerald Carver? Speaking. My name is Eleanor Marsh, she said. My husband was Roy Marsh. He left your number for me to call. A brief silence. Mrs. Marsh. His voice changed. Not dramatically. A slight settling. The way a person settles when something they have been waiting for arrives. I am very glad you called. I have been wondering when you might. You knew he left the number. He told me what he intended. I was sorry to hear he passed before he could show you himself. He paused. He talked about you when we worked together. Not at length. He was not a man who talked at length. But he spoke of you with a particular quality I remember clearly. Another pause. Have you been in the shed? I'm sitting in it now. Then you have some sense of what you have. I have a sense that I don't know enough to understand what I have. That is the correct starting place, Carver said. With respect, Mrs. Marsh, Roy's collection is not something most people have a framework for. That is not a criticism. It took your husband 30 years to develop his own, and he was an exceptionally careful student. He paused. I would like to come and see it in person. The 2019 assessment was thorough, but the market has moved considerably since then, and there are pieces I would want to re-examine in current conditions. Would you permit that? Yes, Eleanor said. When? I can be there Thursday. I'm in Connecticut currently, but the drive is not difficult. Thursday was 2 days from now. She had 7 days left of Marcus's 9. Thursday is fine, she said. She gave Clifford's address. Carver repeated it back with the precision of a man who did not trust himself to remember anything he had not confirmed aloud. He said he would arrive at 9 in the morning and asked if there was anything she would need from him beforehand. She said no. He said he looked forward to meeting her and meant it in the plain, unsentimental way of a person for whom meeting the family of Roy Marsh was itself a specific kind of occasion. She ended the call and sat for a moment in Roy's shed with the phone in her lap. 2 days. She had come to Sycamore Place that morning without a plan, without anywhere to go, with $60 in the grocery bags and the small brass key she had carried for 11 months. She had been evicted from her son's house with a brochure in 9 days. She had walked 3 miles without knowing where she was going and ended up in a padlocked shed full of her dead husband's secrets and $34,000 and the letter he had written for the morning that should have been their 50th anniversary. 2 days until a man named Gerald Carver, who had spent 4 hours in this shed 3 years ago and gone quiet when he saw a 1793 coin, would come and tell her exactly what Roy had built. She walked back to Clifford's house and told him Gerald Carver was coming Thursday. Clifford said he would make sure to be around. He offered her the use of the back room, and she accepted. That evening she moved her 2 grocery bags from the kitchen floor to the back room, which had a good bed and a window over the yard and a view, if she stood at an angle, of the far corner where the shed stood against the back fence. She stood at that window for a while before she went to bed. The shed was dark from outside, but she knew what was in it now. Every binder and every flat box and the green ledger and the safe with its doors swung open and Roy's photograph above the bench. The shed that had glowed from the kitchen window on winter evenings while she did the dishes and found the sight of it reassuring in a way she had never analyzed. She had been right to find it reassuring. She just had not known what it meant. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the tin box. Roy's watch, his pocket knife, his reading glasses, and the cherry box Roy had made, still not opened. She picked it up. It was very light. She could feel, when she tilted it, a gentle shift of weight inside, something sliding from one side to the other. Paper, she thought. Folded paper. The lid lifted off cleanly, exactly as she had known it would. The fit so precise the wood held its own seal. Inside, on a small square of folded navy velvet, lay 52 envelopes. Each one the same size, each one sealed, each one numbered in the front in Roy's handwriting. 1, 2, 3. Continuing. She counted without picking them up, her eyes moving down the rows. 52. She checked the top one. The first. She turned it over. On the back, also in Roy's hand, it read, Year 1. 52 envelopes. One for each year of their marriage. He had written her a letter for every year. He had kept them. He had been adding to the box each year, sealing each one, building that alongside the binders and the flat boxes and the green ledger. He had been writing to her in secret the same way he had been collecting in secret, and she had never known, and he had kept the record of all of it in a cherry box in a fireproof safe in a padlocked shed, waiting for the morning he could hand it to her. She set the box on the nightstand without opening any of the envelopes. She was not ready for those. She understood that they would be there tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Roy had had 52 years of things to say that he had been better at building than speaking. He had said them in the letters, and in the stamps, and in the coins, and in the photograph above the bench. She had the rest of her life to receive them. She turned off the light and lay in the dark. Thursday came with a clear sky and the particular cold of October when the sun is bright and offers nothing. Eleanor was up before 6. She made Clifford's tea and sat at the kitchen table with Roy's main letter in front of her, not reading it again, just looking at his handwriting. At 8:30, she went out to the shed and spent half an hour reviewing the binders on the shelves, reading Roy's notes in the margins, trying to teach herself the vocabulary he had lived in for 50 years. The word perforated, the word gum, the word mint, which in stamps meant something different from what she would have meant by it. The word inverted, which referred to a printing error, and beside which Roy had written, in one margin, only the rarest become legend. At 9:05, a dark green sedan came slowly down Sycamore Place and parked in front of Clifford's house. Gerald Carver was 70, approximately, with the build of a man who had once been athletic and had narrowed rather than softened with age. He wore a gray wool coat and carried a soft-sided case in brown leather that had the worn, smooth look of something used daily for decades. He had silver hair cut short and a face that was precise in its expressions, as though he had spent a lifetime learning to show only what he meant to show. He shook Eleanor's hand at the front gate and looked at her with the specific attention of a man meeting the person Roy had described to him. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "your husband was one of the finest collectors I have encountered in 40 years in this business. I want you to know that before we begin." Eleanor said thank you in the plain way she said thank you when she meant it. She walked him through the yard and opened the shed. She stood in the doorway while he went in ahead of her, and she watched his face as he stood in the middle of the space and looked around. He did not speak for a full minute. He moved slowly along the shelves, reading the spine labels on the binders. He crouched and examined the flat boxes on the lower shelves without opening them. He stood at the workbench and looked at the green ledger, the reference books, the magnifying glass on its stand. He kept everything exactly as it was in 2019, Carver said. "As far as I know," Eleanor said. "I wasn't in here before yesterday." Carver looked at her. "He told me that." He set his case on the bench and unzipped it. Inside were tools she recognized only vaguely from Roy's letter. Small flat forceps, the kind used to handle paper without leaving oils. A loop magnifier, more powerful than the one on the stand. Several small LED lights of different angles. A portable scale. A catalog of his own, newer than the ones Roy had on the shelf, its spine unmarked by use. A working copy from this year. "May I?" He gestured at the binders. "Please." He began with the 1971 volume and worked forward, moving through the years at a pace that was neither rushed nor slow. He handled each binder with the care Eleanor had already noticed, opening them fully flat on the workbench surface, examining individual pages through the loop, occasionally making a quiet note in a small leather notebook he kept open beside him. He did not narrate as he worked. He concentrated. Eleanor sat on the stool and let him concentrate. After the first hour, he had covered roughly a third of the binders. He stopped and asked Eleanor if he could have a cup of water. She went to Clifford's kitchen and brought back a glass, and he drank half of it standing at the bench and set it down and continued without comment. Around 11 o'clock, he stopped at a binder labeled 1988. He opened it to a page toward the back and stood looking at it through the loop for an extended time. Eleanor watched him. He did not move for perhaps 2 minutes. When he set the loop down, he held very still for a moment with his hands at his sides. "These are the 1847 Franklins Roy mentioned," Eleanor said, from the stool. Carver turned and looked at her. "He told you about them. He wrote about them in his letter." Carver nodded, a slow, thoughtful nod. "He was right, too. May I ask if you know what they are worth currently?" He said Gerald Carver was a conservative man, and that when Gerald said conservatively, you should add to the number. Something moved across Carver's face, too brief to name. He looked back at the binder. "Roy overestimated my conservatism," he said. "A matched pair of 1847 5-cent Franklins in the grade these appear to be in, and I will need to authenticate and formally grade them before I can be certain. But from initial examination, a matched pair in this condition sold at auction in the spring of this year for $640,000. He paused. That was a single auction result. Roy has been offered more for these before, by private buyers whose names I can give you. $640,000. Eleanor held the edge of the stool with both hands. "For 2 stamps, she said. "For 2 stamps, Carver said. "Yes." He went back to the binders. Eleanor sat on the stool and looked at Roy's photograph above the bench. Roy at his annual inspection route. Roy in his robe watching the yard. Roy holding her cup with both hands and nodding once because the nod was his language for the thing he was only now. In the letter she had read twice over, finding the words for. By noon Carver had been through the complete binder collection. He had made 3 pages of notes in his small leather notebook. He had flagged 12 specific binders with slips of paper he tore from the notebook's back pages, marking items he wanted to re-examine. He asked Eleanor if he could return to those 12, and she said yes. He spent another hour on the flags. He was most absorbed by the 1869 pictorial pane, which he laid carefully flat on the bench surface on a sheet of clean white paper he produced from his case. He examined it with the loupe for 20 minutes without speaking. When he straightened up, he looked at Eleanor with an expression she had not seen from him yet. "This is," he said, and then stopped. He set the loupe down and put both palms flat on the bench and looked at the pane of 12 stamps from 1869 and made a sound that was not quite a word. "This is extraordinary, Mrs. Marsh. Roy said you went quiet when you saw the coin," Eleanor said. "I remember. I was not expecting that, either." He looked at her. "Your husband had a gift. Not just patience, though he had that in extraordinary measure. He had an eye. The ability to find things that other collectors missed, to recognize potential in pieces that others dismissed or undervalued, to understand not just what something was worth now, but what it would be worth if properly preserved and presented. That is not common." He paused. "It is not teachable. It is either present or it is not." He moved to the flat boxes next, working through them systematically. He stopped at the 1793 chain cent. He held it in its holder and looked at it through the loupe for a long time. "Rarer than the coin by itself," he said, almost to himself, "is the combination of what is in this room. A collector who achieves one of these pieces is doing very well. A collector who achieves several across 2 different disciplines over 50 years with this level of documentation, with this quality of preservation." He set the coin down. Roy built something that will be discussed in this field for some time. He spent the afternoon completing his examination of the coins. At 4 o'clock, he sat down at the workbench across from Eleanor's stool and opened his notebook. "I can give you a preliminary assessment today," he said. "I want to be clear that formal appraisal will require authentication documentation for the most significant pieces and verification by a second specialist for the numismatic collection. But I have been in this field for 40 years, and I have examined this collection twice now, and I want to be honest with you about what I believe you are looking at." Eleanor nodded. "The philatelic collection, the stamps, at current market conditions I would conservatively estimate at between $1.2 and $1.6 million. The pair of 1847 Franklins alone represent a significant portion of that. The 1869 pictorial pane is more difficult to value because a complete pane in this condition is genuinely unusual, and unusual pieces are priced by what a particular buyer is willing to pay. I have a buyer in mind who would pay substantially for that piece." He paused. "The numismatic collection, the coins, I would estimate between $400,000 and $650,000. The chain cent is the anchor piece, but there are strong supporting pieces throughout." He folded his hands on the notebook. "In total, Mrs. Marsh, I believe the complete collection will realize between $1.6 and $2.2 million through a properly managed sale process. That process would take several months. I would handle it, as Roy asked me to, and my commission is standard for the field, 12% of realized value." Eleanor sat on Roy's stool in Roy's shed and held Roy's letter in both hands and looked at Gerald Carver. $2 million. Perhaps more. From a padlocked shed at the back of a rented yard on Sycamore Place. From 50 years of evening hours and careful eyes and the unhurried, patient accumulation of small, beautiful things that Roy Marsh had understood were worth more than anyone around him suspected, and had kept because he knew their value even when no one else did. "He said you were an honest man," Eleanor said. "He said that in the letter. He said it was rarer than a mint 1847 Franklin and worth considerably more." Carver smiled. It was a small smile, contained, but genuinely there. "That sounds like Roy. He also said when you said conservatively, I should add to the number." Carver looked at his notebook for a moment. Then he looked up. "I stand by my estimate. But I will tell you that in the 12 months since I last examined the market for these specific types of pieces, values have moved in a direction that would favor your position. I will not promise you more than I can substantiate, but I am not pessimistic." After he left, Eleanor walked the shed one more time alone. She walked it slowly, as she had done the morning before, but differently now. She had a number. She had a framework. She had Gerald Carver's 3 pages of notes and Roy's green ledger with its 50 years of precise entries and the 2015 catalog opened to the inside back cover where Roy had written a phone number and 2 words that had turned out to mean exactly what they said. She stood in front of the wall of binders and ran her finger along the spines. 1971, 1972, 1973, the years she and Roy had been learning each other, beginning to build a life in the particular modest way they would go on building it for the next 50 years. He had been building this too, in parallel, in the evenings, in the shed she had watched from the kitchen window and found reassuring without knowing what the reassurance was for. She understood now. The light in the shed in the winter evenings had been reassuring because Roy was in there. The fact of him in the room, where he was most fully himself, doing the work that was his own language for what he could not say out loud. The light in the shed had always meant Roy was in there building something for her. She had been right to find it reassuring. She had been right about everything important. She had just not known how much there was. She turned off the overhead light and pulled the shed door closed behind her. The padlock was in her coat pocket. She clicked it shut on the hasp and heard the mechanism engage, firm and final, the same sound Roy had heard every evening for 30 years when he locked it behind him and walked back across the yard to the kitchen where his wife was waiting. She walked back across the yard to Clifford's kitchen, where the kettle was already on and Clifford was at the table with his newspaper and the kind of patient, uncomplicated company that asks nothing and offers everything a person actually needs. She sat down and told him what Carver had said. Clifford listened. When she was done, he looked at his newspaper for a moment, then looked back at her. Roy was a man who kept his word, he said. He told you once that you would be all right. He was just more specific about it than you knew. Eleanor held her teacup in both hands. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was settling into the particular gray gold of late afternoon in October, the light going flat and long before dark. The rose bush against the back fence. The shed at the far corner. The old oak turning above it, gold and rust, and the amber she had been seeing all week and would keep seeing until the cold took the last of it. She thought about Marcus. She had not thought about him much since that morning, not with any particular force. He was there, a fact of the day that she had set aside to deal with later, the way you set aside something heavy that you cannot carry and also do the other thing that needs doing first. Later was going to come. She knew that. She had 9 days, 7 now, and Marcus expected her to be gone or settled or arranged by the 15th. He did not know about the shed. Diane did not know about the shed. Neither of them had any idea that on the morning Diane set a brochure on the kitchen table and told Eleanor it was time to make more appropriate arrangements. Eleanor had walked 3 miles to a padlocked shed and opened it with a key she had carried for 11 months, and inside was Roy. His whole secret life, his 50-year devotion, his letter, his plan, his collection worth more than $2 million, and the $34,000 in the safe that was already hers, and the 52 letters in the cherry box on the nightstand that she was not yet ready to read, but that would be there, all of them, every year, whenever she was. Marcus was going to find out. That was a conversation that was coming with the particular inevitability of things that cannot be postponed. Eleanor understood this without dreading it. She had been a 5th-grade teacher for 27 years. She had explained difficult things to children and to parents who behaved like children and to systems that resisted the truth until the truth sat down across from them and refused to leave. She could have that conversation. She had been evicted from her son's house with $60 and 2 grocery bags on a morning 7 days ago, and she had walked 3 miles on purpose without knowing she was going anywhere and found her way to the back of a yard in October and put a key in a lock and opened a door and found Roy in there. All of him. Everything he had not known how to say. Waiting in the dark the way he always waited. Patient and thorough and completely sure she would come eventually. She was not afraid of the conversation with Marcus. She was not afraid of anything in the way she had been afraid on the morning of the eviction, standing on the front steps with her coat on and her 2 grocery bags and nowhere to go. That fear was a practical fear, the fear of a person who does not know what comes next. She knew what came next now. What came next was Gerald Carver's return with his authentication documentation and his list of buyers for the 1869 pictorial pane, and his 40 years in a field. Roy had spent 50 years teaching himself from the inside of a locked shed. What came next was the green ledger and the 52 letters in the cherry box and the photograph from 1984 in her coat pocket. What came next was Clifford's kitchen and the room with the view of the shed and the October mornings and whatever came after October. What came next was everything Roy had been building toward, patiently, on purpose, without fanfare or expectation of remark. She picked up her tea and drank it while it was still warm. Marcus called on the 8th day. Eleanor was in Clifford's kitchen when the phone rang, sitting with her second cup of tea and Roy's green ledger open in front of her. She had spent the previous 2 evenings working through it page by page, learning the system Roy had used for 50 years to track every acquisition, every sale, every trade. His handwriting in the ledger was smaller than in the letter, the script of a man writing for himself rather than for someone else, abbreviated in ways she was still decoding. PH for philately, N for numismatic, Abbrev for the dealer abbreviations he had assigned, C for Carver. The ledger was almost 200 pages, and she had reached 1993. She set down the ledger and answered, "Mom." Marcus's voice carried the slight over-control of someone who has prepared what they're going to say and is now executing the preparation. "The 15th is tomorrow. I wanted to check in and see where things stand." "Where things stand?" As though she were a project with a milestone. "Things stand well," Eleanor said. A pause. "So you found a place?" "Westfield said there's still availability. I could call them if..." "I'm not going to Westfield, Marcus." Another pause. Longer. "Mom, we talked about this. I understand it's not your first choice, but I'm staying with Clifford Oaks. He's offered me the back room in exchange for looking after the property while he's up north." Marcus was quiet for a moment. She could hear, in the background of his call, what sounded like the kitchen at his house, the specific hum of the refrigerator she had listened to for 11 months. "Clifford, the old landlord." "Yes. That's not a permanent solution. That's just..." He stopped. Started again. "I want to make sure you're taken care of. That's all I'm saying." Eleanor held the phone and looked at the ledger. 1993. Roy had made 4 acquisitions that year and 1 significant sale, a foreign collection he had assembled over 6 years and decided was outside the core focus he was building. The entry read, "Sold at net profit, reinvested in domestic issues per plan." Per plan. Roy had always had a plan. "I want to talk to you about something Roy left," Eleanor said. "Something I found at the property." "At Sycamore Place?" "Mom, whatever's left in that yard isn't his shed," she said. "Roy's locked shed. I opened it 4 days ago. Clifford let me come through the yard." Silence. "There was a collection inside," Eleanor said. "Stamps and coins. 50 years of careful collecting. He had a dealer authenticate the significant pieces 3 years ago. I've spoken with that dealer this week." She paused. "His preliminary estimate for the full collection is between $1.6 and $2.2 million. The silence on the other end was not a silence of disbelief. It was the silence of a person whose understanding of a situation has just been replaced by an entirely different understanding, and the replacement is happening faster than the words can follow. "Mom, there is also $34,000 in a fireproof safe. Cash. Roy saved it from sales over the years. That money is already in my account." She had deposited it the morning after she counted it on the bench, walking into the bank on Main Street with a paper bag of banded bills and sitting across from a young teller who had not once changed his expression. "I am not in need of Westfield, Marcus. I am not in need of your arrangements. I wanted you to know." She heard him breathe. "I'll come tomorrow," he said. His voice had lost its prepared quality. It was just his voice now, without the architecture around it. "All right," Eleanor said. She hung up and returned to the ledger. 1994. Roy had found the Confederate States series he mentioned in the letter, bought through a specialist dealer in Virginia, whose abbreviation was VAD. He paid $430 for the lot and noted in the margin, in his careful pencil, "Condition better than listed, worth holding long-term." He had been right. Carver had flagged the Confederate series among the pieces he wanted to re-examine. Marcus arrived the next morning at 10. He drove up Sycamore Place and parked in front of Clifford's house and sat in the car for a while before getting out. Eleanor was already in the yard. She had been in the shed since 8, continuing her work with the ledger, but she heard his engine and came out to meet him at the gate. He looked different from the last time she had seen him, which had been the morning of the eviction, which she had not actually seen him at all because he had left for his early meeting before she came downstairs. She had not seen Marcus in person since a Sunday dinner 6 weeks before the morning of the brochure, when he had sat at his own kitchen table in the careful, slightly remote way he sat when something was bothering him and he had not yet decided to say what it was. He was thinner. His hair had grown longer than he usually wore it, and he had not shaved that morning. He was wearing a jacket she recognized from years ago, a brown corduroy one he had kept from before his marriage. He stood at the gate with his hands in his pockets and looked at her. "Mom," he said. "Come in," she said. She took him through the yard. She showed him the shed. She opened the padlock with the brass key, the same way she had done 9 days ago when the key had finally found what had opened, and pulled the door wide and stepped back. Marcus stood in the doorway. The binders were still on the shelves. Carver had explained that formal removal and transport to his authentication facility would happen the following week, once he had completed the paperwork for the auction house consignment and the private buyer agreements. So the room was still intact, still Roy's room as Roy had arranged it. The binders in their year-labeled rows, the flat boxes on the lower shelves, the green ledger on the bench, the magnifying glass on its stand. The safe sat open, its door swung back, empty now except for the cherry box, which Eleanor had moved back inside the safe for safekeeping. Marcus went in slowly. He moved the way she had moved 9 days ago, with the cautious attention of someone entering a place they do not have a vocabulary for. He looked at the shelves. He read the binder spines. He crouched and looked at the flat boxes. He stood at the bench and put both hands on the surface and looked at the far wall without focusing on anything in particular. "Dad built this bench," he said. "Yes. In the first year at Sycamore Place. I remember him building it. I was 4 or 5. He let me hold the level." Marcus looked at the bench surface. It was worn at the center, lighter than at the edges, the wood smoothed by 40 years of Roy's hands and forearms and the weight of whatever he set down on it. "He would never let me in here. All those years. I used to think it was because he was working on something for Christmas when I was a kid. Then I thought it was just his private place, and that was fine." He paused. "I never asked him about it." "Neither did I," Eleanor said. He straightened up and turned to look at her. He had Frank's eyes, she thought, though Frank was Roy, and she corrected herself. He had Roy's eyes. The same color, the same particular way of settling on a person when something important was being said. $1.5 million, he said. "Between 1.6 and 2.2. Carver is conservative," Roy said, to add to whatever number Carver gives. Marcus pressed his lips together. He looked at the binders again. The long, orderly rows. 1971 at the far left. 2021 at the near right. Roy adding to the end of the row every year, for 50 years, labeling each spine with the same square handwriting he used for everything that mattered. "I didn't know," Marcus said. "I want you to know that I didn't know about any of this." "I know you didn't." "If I had known," he stopped. He put his hand on the back of the stool worn smooth on the seat from Roy's weight. "I still did what I did, Mom. I know that. Knowing about the collection wouldn't change what I did. I just want you to know it wasn't because of money. The way I handled things." He struggled with the next part. "Diane wanted the house sold. I wanted to make her happy, and I took the easier path, and I told myself it was the right thing, and I made it into the right thing in my own head until it was too late to make it into something else." Eleanor looked at her son. He was 46 years old. He was wearing the corduroy jacket he had kept from his 20s, and he had not shaved, and he was holding the stool that his father had sat on every evening for 30 years, and he was telling her the truth. Not perfectly. Not with the full self-examination that would take much longer than one morning in a shed. But the frame of the truth was there, and he was not flinching from it. "I know," she said again. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry in a way that doesn't fix anything. I know that. But I'm sorry." She stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at her son and thought about Roy's letter. "The only thing I regret is that I was better at showing it in wood and paper and coin than I was at saying it out loud where you could hear me." Roy had been terrible at apologies for the same reason. He did not have a language for the large emotional confessions. He had a language for the things he built. She had spent 52 years learning that language and learning to be patient with its limits. Marcus had never learned it. That was, she understood now, something she had also done wrong, or not done at all. She had been so fluent in Roy's private grammar that she had not thought to teach it explicitly to the boy who grew up in their house and absorbed their routines and their rhythms and their unspoken arrangement without anyone sitting him down to explain what the arrangement meant. She could not give him that back now, but she could tell him the truth. "You left me at a motel," she said. "You didn't come back. You told Diane to deliver the news about the brochure because you didn't want to be in the room when it landed. You have a habit, Marcus, of arranging things from a distance and then being absent when those arrangements have their consequences. He did not look away. Yes. Roy never did that. Not once in 52 years. Marcus looked at the stool. His hand was still on the back of it. No, he wouldn't. I'm not going to tell you everything is fine, because it is not fine. Not yet. But I love you in the way I have always loved you, which is not a love that switches off because you disappoint me. What I need from you is time, and I need you to not decide what I need from a distance. He nodded. His jaw was working. He was Roy's son, she thought. Terrible at the large declaration, at the open display of what he was feeling. He was holding himself very still in the way Roy held himself still when something was costing him more than he wanted to show. Can I come back? He said. In a few weeks. When things have settled. The door is open, Eleanor said. It always has been. She walked him back through the yard and to his car. He walked beside her in silence, his hands in the pockets of the corduroy jacket, looking at the garden the way people look at things when they need somewhere to rest their eyes while they think. At the gate he stopped. He was looking at the rose bush on the left side of the yard, the one she and Roy had shared through the fence for 31 years. It was dormant in October, bare and angular, unpruned, the canes crossing each other in the particular disorder that comes from a few seasons of inattention. He planted that the year I was born, Marcus said. He did. Marcus looked at it for another moment. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was not performing anything, not arranging his face into something more appropriate than what it was. He was just standing at the gate of a yard looking at a rose bush his father had planted 46 years ago, and the loss of that man was visible on him in the specific way loss is visible on people who have not let themselves feel it fully yet because there was always something else pressing. I didn't come to the shed when he was alive, Marcus said. Not once. I used to walk past the door when I visited, and I would think I should ask him about it sometime. What he does in there. And I never did. He paused. I was always going to do it sometime. Ask him what was in there. So was I, Eleanor said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted into something more honest. Is that true? Yes. I always meant to ask, and I didn't want to push, and I trusted that he would tell me when it was time. She looked at the rose bush. He was going to. He had a specific morning planned. I just didn't know. Marcus pressed his lips together. I'm going to have to live with that for a while. Not asking. Both of us not asking, and him in there every evening. He turned the gate latch in his hand without opening it. There are a lot of things with Dad that I'm going to have to live with for a while. I know, Eleanor said. So will I. That's not unusual for the people left behind. He looked at her steadily. It was the most sustained eye contact he had made with her in the whole of the morning, possibly in the whole of the 11 months. Roy's eyes, holding. How are you, Mom? Really? She considered the question with the care it deserved. I am better than I was 9 days ago, she said. I am not done being hurt, but I am better. He nodded once. It was Roy's nod. She was certain he didn't know it. He sat in the car for a moment with his hands on the wheel, not starting the engine. Then he looked at her through the window with Roy's eyes, and she gave him a small nod. Back, not Roy's nod exactly, but something in the same family, a nod that meant I see you, and he drove away. She stood at the gate until the car turned the corner. Then she went back to the shed and sat on the stool and opened the ledger to 1994 and kept reading. Carver returned the following Tuesday with 2 colleagues from the authentication firm he worked with, a woman named Dr. Priya Shah, who specialized in 19th-century American philately, and a younger man named Tom Acevedo, who handled the numismatic side. They arrived at 9 and worked through the day. Dr. Shah spent 4 hours on the 1847 Franklins alone, examining them under magnification, testing the paper weight, measuring the margins with a micrometer gauge, checking the perforations with a specialized tool that counted teeth per centimeter. Eleanor watched from the stool when she was in the shed and from the yard when she needed air. Clifford brought out sandwiches at noon and set them on the garden bench without asking if anyone wanted them. Everyone ate eventually. Dr. Shah ate standing up, still reading from the Scott catalog, turning pages with one hand. At the end of the day, Dr. Shah stood at the bench and looked at her notes for a long time. Then she looked at Eleanor. The pair of 1847 Franklins are grading better than Gerald indicated, she said. I would call these very fine to extremely fine on the standard scale. In the current market, I would recommend a reserve price of no less than $700,000 at auction. She paused. I have seen one matched pair in this grade in my career. 1. Eleanor said thank you and meant it. Tom Acevedo presented his coin findings with the systematic calm of a man who delivered good news and bad news in exactly the same tone. The 1793 chain sent was confirmed in fine 12, a specific grade within the fine designation, which he explained meant the date was clear, the chain complete, the liberty visible. He placed a current auction estimate of $160,000 to $210,000 on that piece alone. The broader coin collection was strong throughout, he said. Roy had an eye for condition that most collectors developed slowly and some never developed at all. They packed the collection carefully the next morning, Carver and his colleagues, in archival quality materials they had brought from the city. Each binder went into a padded sleeve and then a sealed box labeled with its contents in Carver's precise handwriting. The flat coin boxes went into foam-lined transport cases. The ledger, which Carver needed for provenance documentation, was photographed page by page on Clifford's kitchen table and then packed. The bench and tools were left as Roy had arranged them. The shed would sit empty for the first time since 1971. Eleanor watched the boxes loaded into the van. She had the cherry box in her coat pocket. The photograph from the bench was already there. Those two things were hers in a way that had nothing to do with the auction process, nothing to do with realized value or commission structures or reserve prices. Those two things were Roy's voice and Roy's eye watching her from 40 years ago, and she kept them on her person. When the van pulled away from Sycamore Place, Eleanor went back into the empty shed and stood in the middle of it. The pegboard was bare. The shelves were empty. The bench surface showed the wear of 50 years of use, lighter at the center, darker at the edges, the ghost of Roy's hands in the wood itself. The stool stood beside the bench, unchanged, still worn smooth. The single overhead light was on. The window was still dusty on the inside. The door was open and the October yard was behind her, the rose bush and the old oak and Clifford's kitchen window where the light was on. She sat on the stool one last time. She sat there for a long while without doing anything. The shed was quiet in the way it had probably always been quiet. The shed sounds, the slight tick of the corrugated roof in the temperature change, the faint press of wind against the wooden siding. Roy's sounds. The sounds he had lived with every evening for 30 years while she stood at the kitchen window on the other side of the yard and watched the light come through the window and felt certain about things she had not fully known. She was still certain. She wanted to make sure she held on to that. The certainty she had felt watching the light was not wrong simply because she had not understood its source. She had been right that Roy was in there. She had been right that the light meant something reassuring. She had been right about the most important thing, which was that the love Roy was unable to say out loud was not absent. It was present everywhere she had not yet looked. She stood and turned off the overhead light, and pulled the door shut behind her and clicked the padlock closed. She put the key in her pocket next to the cherry box and the photograph. She walked across the yard to Clifford's kitchen. The first auction was held in New York 6 weeks later. Carver managed it. He called Eleanor the morning of the auction and suggested she not try to follow the bidding online in real time, as auction platforms were unreliable for pacing and the waiting was hard on the nerves. She took his advice. She sat in Clifford's kitchen with a book she was not reading and waited. He called at 4:15 in the afternoon. The 1847 Franklin sold, he said. For how much? $715,000, Carver said. After my commission, you will receive $629,200. The winning bid came from a private collector in Massachusetts who had been waiting for a pair in this grade for 11 years. He was not going to let them go. Eleanor set the book down on the table. $715,000. 42 stamps Roy had bought in 1988 and kept in a binder on a shelf in a locked shed on Sycamore Place. Gerald, she said. Yes. Roy said you went quiet when you saw the coins in 2019. I did. He was right that you were impressed. Carver was quiet for a moment. The chain sent is on the auction schedule for January, he said. I expect a similar result. The private sale of the 1869 pictorial pane happened 2 weeks after that. Carver had been right that he had a buyer in mind. A collector in Chicago had been looking for a complete pane of the 1869 issue for 20 years. He paid $345,000 without a counteroffer, which Carver said was the behavior of a man who recognized that he was looking at something he would not see again and was not willing to risk it for the sake of negotiating. Eleanor received her payment and sat with the number and did not know what to feel about it. Not in a bad way. In the way of something too large to absorb all at once. The way a person feels standing at the edge of a body of water they have never seen before and trying to understand its scale. She had been a fifth-grade teacher for 27 years and a county water authority inspector's wife for 52. Her understanding of money had always been specific and practical. The grocery list calculated to the dollar, the furnace cost paid back over 6 careful months. She did not have a framework for the numbers Carver was calling her with. She called the bank and asked for a private appointment with a financial advisor. She went on a Wednesday morning and sat across from a woman named Patricia, who had the steady, unpanicked manner of someone who had helped people navigate large, unexpected money before and knew that the first thing needed was not investment strategy, but a cup of tea and a clear explanation of what everything meant. Patricia gave her both. Eleanor made 2 decisions in that first meeting. The rest could wait, she said, until she understood better what she had. Patricia agreed. The 2 decisions were these. She was going to buy a house, a small one, near Sycamore Place, something with a yard where she could grow things in the spring. And she was going to establish a scholarship fund in Roy's name at the county community college for students pursuing trades, because Roy had spent 38 years at the county water authority starting as a maintenance crew member and never lost respect for the particular intelligence of people who worked with their hands and their eyes and their accumulated knowledge of how systems actually function below the surface of things. Patricia noted both decisions on her pad without comment. Eleanor found the house in November. It was 3 blocks from Sycamore Place, a small white clapboard with green shutters, which she did not plan until she drove past it and stopped the car and thought, and then understood she had not planned it. Roy's colors. She had not consciously intended to choose Roy's colors. She chose them anyway and did not consider changing them. The house had a yard that needed work. The garden had been neglected for 2 or 3 years. Good bones in the soil, the man she hired to assess it said, just wants consistent attention. Eleanor recognized that description. It applied to most worthwhile things. She moved in on a Friday in December. She had very little furniture. Clifford had offered her a few pieces from the spare room, and she accepted a small dresser and a reading chair. She bought a bed. The kitchen was bare except for the gas range she had requested when she first walked through with the realtor, who had noted her specific look at the range and correctly identified it as important. The first piece of furniture she moved into the house was Roy's stool from the shed. She carried it herself from the back of Clifford's car, a short man's stool worn smooth on the seat, and she set it at the kitchen counter. It was the right height for that counter. She did not think Roy had designed it for any kitchen but his own, but it fit as though he had measured the space. She stood in the kitchen on the first evening in her house and looked at the stool and the gas range and the yard through the window, bare and brown in the December cold, but with the specific promise of ground that had grown things before and would grow them again. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the one chair she had brought from Clifford's and opened the cherry box. She had been carrying it in her coat pocket for 6 weeks. She had been not opening it for 6 weeks with the same patient certainty she had applied to everything since October. She had known she would open it when she was ready, and she had known she would know when that was. The first evening in her own house, at her own kitchen table, with Roy's stool at the counter and the yard waiting outside the window, felt like the right time. She lifted the 52 envelopes out carefully and set them in a row on the table. She picked up the one marked Year 1. She opened it. Roy's handwriting on a single sheet of paper. Smaller than the letter from the shed, more concentrated. The writing of a young man still working out who he was and how he said what he meant. He had been 24 in Year 1. She had been 23. They had been married for 8 months. Eleanor, I am writing this at the workbench in the shed at 11 o'clock at night. The house is quiet. You are asleep. I went out here to work on a small piece I've been trying to get right. And instead I sat down and I started thinking about the year we have had, and I decided I wanted to write it down while I still had the specific details. You corrected my grammar 3 times this year, and you were right every time, which I did not admit out loud, but I am admitting now. You made the grocery list on Tuesdays and left it on the counter where I would see it on my way out, and the list always had something on it that was not strictly necessary, but that you knew I would want a bag of. The oranges from the display by the door, or the coffee that costs more than the other coffee. You never mentioned those additions. You just put them on the list. I am building something in here. I don't know yet what it will become, but I know it is for you. I know that about it, even at the beginning. I love you, Eleanor. I should say it more. I will try. Roy, she folded the letter carefully and put it back in the year 1 envelope and set it on the table. She picked up the one marked year 48. 2021, the year before Roy died. His handwriting on that sheet was slightly more deliberate than in year 1, the hand of a man in his early 70s who wrote slowly enough to mean every word. Eleanor, 48 years. I went into the shed this evening, and I took out the 1847 Franklins, and I held the binder in my hands, and I thought about the Tuesday in 1988 when I found them through the dealer in Providence and drove 2 hours in a borrowed truck to pick them up and couldn't tell you why I was going or where I'd been. I told you I'd been to see a friend from the county. I don't think you believed me. You didn't ask. 2 more years. I can do 2 more years. I want to do it right. I want to see your face. I am sorry that I am not better at this. At saying the thing plainly. You have always been patient with me about it, and I have always taken advantage of that patience, and I am sorry. The truth is that when I try to say it plainly, it comes out smaller than what I mean, and I would rather build something the right size than say something the wrong size. I know that is not a complete defense. Here is what I mean. 48 years of waking up beside you, and none of them felt like what I expected when I was 24 and thinking about what 48 years might feel like. They felt better. Quieter than I expected and better. I love you. 2 more years. Roy. Eleanor set the letter down on the table. She sat for a long time. He had known, perhaps, that he was running out of time. Not with the specific foreknowledge of the medical, but with the sense a body gives a person in their early 70s, the accumulation of small warnings that you choose to defer. He had been trying to get to the anniversary. He had been so close. She thought about 2 more years written on a piece of paper in a man's deliberate hand at a workbench in a shed in the evening. She thought about the morning she had walked 3 miles to Sycamore Place without knowing she was going there and put a key in a lock. She thought about the $60 and the grocery bags and the brochure with the woman smiling at the geranium. She thought about all of it and felt it settle into something she could carry. Not easily, not without weight, but steadily, the way a person carries something they have decided to carry and made their peace with. The 1793 chain scent sold in January at auction for $192,000. The rest of the coin collection sold over 3 months through Aceveto's recommended numismatic house, realizing $438,000 across the full lot. The remaining philatelic pieces sold through a combination of auction and private sale over the following 4 months. When Carver called with the final accounting in May, the total realized across all sales was $2,163,000. After Carver's commission of 12%, Eleanor received $1,903,040, plus the $34,220 from the safe, $1,937,260, from a padlocked shed at the back of a rented yard on a gravel road off Sycamore Place, from 50 years of evenings, from the patient, accumulated work of a man who had not known how to say what he meant and had found another language for it. The news reached the county paper through the auction records, which are public. A reporter named Christine called Eleanor on a Thursday afternoon and asked if she would speak with her. Eleanor said she would speak with her briefly. Christine came to the house on Sycamore Place, the new house with Roy's colors, and sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and asked careful, honest questions and listened to the answers the same way. Christine was 32 and had the specific quality of a person who had chosen journalism because she was genuinely interested in people rather than in the shape a story could be made to take. She asked Eleanor how she had found the shed. She asked about the key. She asked about the 19 months of carrying it without knowing what had opened. She asked about Carver and about the letter and about the 1847 Franklins and about the 52 envelopes in the cherry box. She did not ask about Marcus. Eleanor noticed the omission and understood it as a courtesy. She asked one question at the end that Eleanor had not expected. When you opened the shed door, Christine said, and you saw the binders, the organization, the 50 years of Roy's work, what did you feel first? Eleanor had thought about that moment many times since October. She had turned it over in the evenings at Clifford's kitchen table, turned it over on the drive back from the auction house, when Carver called with the first number, turned it over in the garden on the April morning she planted the peas. She had been trying to find the right word for what she felt when the light came in through the door of Roy's shed, and she saw the shelves. "Known," she said. "I think what I felt first was known. As though I had just been introduced to the person I had been married to for 50 years, and the introduction confirmed everything I had already believed about him without being able to prove." Christine wrote that down in her notebook and said nothing for a moment. "That's the whole story," Christine said. In one word. The article ran on a Sunday. The headline read, "Widow finds late husband's 50-year secret." And everything he couldn't say out loud. Carver saw it. He called to say it was a good piece and a fair accounting. Dr. Shaw sent a brief note saying she had shared it with her colleagues at the authentication firm. Tom Acevedo mentioned that the buyer of the chain sent had also read it and had asked that it be conveyed to Mrs. Marsh that the coin would be well cared for. 3 people from Eleanor's old school sent cards. A former student, now in his late 30s, wrote a single paragraph about the year she had taught him that patience was not the same as passivity, that waiting for the right moment and doing nothing were different behaviors that looked the same from the outside and were entirely different on the inside. She had taught him that in the 5th grade. She did not remember saying it, but she believed she had said it because she had believed it then and believed it now. Darnell, Roy's colleague who had been with him the morning he died, read the article and called Clifford's number, which was still the one on file. Clifford gave him Eleanor's new number. Darnell called on a Sunday. He had a slow, careful way of talking, the voice of a man who chose his words before he said them. He said he had known something was different about Roy from the other inspectors. He said Roy was the only man he had ever worked alongside who could walk the same stretch of water main for 16 years and still look at it with genuine attention every time. He said he was glad Eleanor had found the shed. He said Roy had mentioned her on their Wednesday routes. Not often, not at length, but with the particular quality of someone mentioning the place they most wanted to be. He said he thought she should know that. She thanked Darnell and told him he was welcome to come by for tea when he was in the area. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Marcus called, not on the deadline and not with arrangements, but on a Tuesday evening in early spring when there was no immediate reason to call except that he had been thinking about her and wanted to hear her voice. They talked for 40 minutes. He asked about the house and the yard, and she told him about the garden she was planning, what she was going to plant, and where, and in what order. He listened. He asked questions. He did not offer advice about what she should do. Before he hung up, he said, "Mom, I found something of Dad's. In some boxes that got put in storage when we cleared out Sycamore Place. A small album. Navy blue cover with initials stamped in gold, mostly worn off. I think it might be his father's." Eleanor was quiet. "I didn't open it," he said. "I wasn't sure if it was something you'd want, or something for somewhere else. I just wanted you to know I have it." "Bring it when you come," she said. "I'd like to have it." He said he would come in June, and she said the door was open. She planted the garden in April. Potatoes and peas along the south fence, tomatoes in the middle beds, herbs along the kitchen wall where they would be close enough to pick without a trip through the whole yard. She planted a rose bush in the corner nearest the kitchen window. A small one, not yet impressive, but with the specific look of something that intended to stay. She carried the cherry box outside on the first warm afternoon and sat on the back step and read 3 more of Roy's letters in the sun. Year 3, Year 12, Year 29. Each one Roy's voice, precise and a little formal and exact in the way he was exact about everything, saying the things he could say and writing that he could not say standing in the kitchen before the words got smaller than what he meant. In Year 12, he wrote about watching her grade papers at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night and understanding that she would do that for the rest of her working life and never once complain about it, and finding that the most specific and honest expression of love he had ever encountered. In Year 29, he wrote about a morning she had been upset about something at school, something a parent had said, and how she had not told him what it was, but had sat beside him on the porch swing after dinner, and he had not asked because he understood she needed the company and not the conversation, and how knowing the difference between those two things without being told had seemed to him, that evening, like the whole of what a marriage was. In Year 36, he wrote about a Sunday in August at the rented cottage, the one they had used for 22 years before the owner sold the property. He wrote that she had fallen asleep in a chair on the dock reading a novel, and he had sat in the chair beside her for 2 hours not reading anything, just watching the water and listening to her breathe, and he had thought that he was possibly the most fortunate man he knew, and that the fortune was entirely the specific kind that no one could see from the outside. He wrote that he had thought about telling her that when she woke up and had not, because she would have said something sensible and true about it, and the sensible truth would have made it smaller than it was in his chest. She read those letters and set them in the sun and let herself feel what they cost, and also what they gave, which were not the same thing, and were both real, and were both Roy, her husband of 52 years, writing to her from the shed in the evenings with the overhead light on while she stood at the kitchen window, and found the sight of it reassuring in a way she had never analyzed because she had never needed to. She understood now. She had never needed to analyze the reassurance because she had been right about it from the beginning. The light in the shed meant Roy was in there loving her in the only language he had been given, and it was enough. It had always been enough. And now she had the letters too, 46 more of them, each one waiting in its sealed envelope with its year marked on the front, and she had the rest of her life to receive them. Clifford came for Sunday dinners most weeks. He was up north with Margaret's sister, but he drove back on weekends. And on Sunday evenings he came to Eleanor's table and ate her food and told her about the state of the property and about Margaret's sister, who was doing better than expected and worse than hoped, and exactly as complicated as all of us are. Eleanor told him about the garden and about the letters and about the scholarship fund, which had received its first 4 applications and whose selection committee she was chairing alongside 2 members of the county community college faculty. She had named the scholarship the Roy Thomas Marsh Award for Trades and Infrastructure. She had chosen those words carefully. Trades and infrastructure. The practical, intelligent work of people who kept invisible systems running. Roy had kept invisible systems running for 38 years and had done it with the attention and patience of someone who understood that the things other people never thought about required, precisely because of that, the most consistent and deliberate care. Patricia, the financial advisor, came for tea one Thursday and showed Eleanor the current state of her accounts and a proposed longer-term plan. Eleanor listened, asked 3 specific questions, and told Patricia she trusted her judgment on the rest. She said this in the plain way she said things she meant. Patricia said she would make sure the money worked as hard as Roy had. Eleanor walked her to the door and watched her drive away and thought that was possibly the best way it could have been said. The money working as hard as Roy had. She thought Roy would have found that a fair accounting. She did not rush through them. She had 46 left to read, and she intended to read each one when she was ready and not before. Roy had written them over 50 years with the same patience he brought to everything. She could receive them the same way. On a morning in May, she was in the yard with her coffee, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the rose bush, when she understood something that had been working toward the surface for months. She had been looking for Roy for 19 months without knowing she was looking. In the shed at Sycamore Place, in the binders, in the flat boxes, in the green ledger, in Carver's careful accounting, in Dr. Shaw's 4 hours with a pair of stamps. She had been finding him piece by piece, each piece more specific and more his than anything she had known while he was alive, and she had thought that was a strange and painful kind of finding. But she was still finding him. In the letters in the cherry box, in the stool at the kitchen counter worn smooth on the right side, in the rose bush in the corner, in the yard she was building towards something without knowing what. In Clifford's steady company and the long afternoons on Sycamore Place and the house with Roy's colors she had chosen without meaning to. He was not gone in the way she had understood gone to mean. He was in the things he had built, which was the only place he had ever been most fully present. He had said as much in the letter. He had been building her something for 50 years, and the building was not finished when he died, and she was still inside it, and would be for as long as she lived in it and tended it. The morning light came through the kitchen window and fell across Roy's stool at the counter. She stood in the yard with her coffee and looked at the light on the old worn wood and thought about the kitchen window at Sycamore Place and the light she had watched from there, amber in the winter evenings, coming from the shed where Roy worked. She had been right to find it reassuring. She had been right about the most important thing, which is that the love a person carries for you does not require your witness to be real. Roy had built her $2 million and 52 years of letters in a room she never entered, and every evening she had stood at the kitchen window looking at the light and felt certain, without knowing why, that everything was where it should be. She was still certain. She finished her coffee. She went inside and set the cup beside Roy's stool and put her coat on and went out to the garden because the peas needed tying and the tomato seedlings needed moving to the south bed before the afternoon. And there was always more to do, and the morning was good, and she was exactly where Roy had been building toward for 50 years. The peas were strong. She worked along the fence for an hour, the soil cold and soft under her knees, her hands finding the rhythm of the work the way they always found it. She was 60 years from the girl who had learned to tend a garden from her own mother in a yard 2 towns over and 30 from the woman who had grown beans and tomatoes in the narrow strip of soil along the Sycamore Place fence. The work was the same work. Her hands were older, and they remembered it anyway. The rose bush in the corner had put out 2 new canes since she planted it. Thin, still, not yet committed to their direction, but there. Roy's colors on the house and Roy's stool at the counter, and Roy's rose bush in the corner, and Roy's letters in the cherry box on the kitchen table. The most important things a person leaves are never the ones they plan. They are the ones that were always there, in the dark, waiting to be found. She stood up from the peas and brushed the soil from her knees. The yard in May was nothing like the October yard she had walked into when she opened the shed door, nothing like the bare ground and the bare rose canes and the oak with its last leaves. The oak here was an old apple tree, gnarled and generous, and it was in full bloom above the south fence, white flowers dropping slowly onto the beds below. She would have apples in September. She had not thought about that when she bought the house. She was thinking about it now. She went inside, washed her hands at the kitchen sink, and looked at Roy's stool while the water ran warm. Small, worn, the right height for this counter. She dried her hands on the dish towel she had hung from the oven handle, the same way she had always hung it, the same way she would go on hanging it. She put the kettle on. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.